Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Congressman Guy Reschenthaler. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Brittany, thanks for having me on, and please just call me Guy. And I just want to thank you for covering this story because the only way we're going to get the Biden administration to act here is through media attention, unfortunately. So thank you for the help on this.
Of course, it's a really crazy story to hear. I'm sure many of our viewers have heard what's happening. Multiple Americans have been detained in Turks and Caicos for allegedly traveling with ammunition in their bags, which they have said was mistakenly. You traveled with a bipartisan and bicameral group to Turks and Caicos recently. Can you talk about that experience for us?
Yes, so just recently I went with this congressional delegation. We went into Turks and Caicos. We met with the State Department officials there on the islands, U.S. State Department. We met with the detainees. We met with some of their family members. We also met with business leaders of Turks and Caicos, for example, those involved with the resorts like Beaches and Sandals and the hotels as well. And then we also had a meeting with the government officials on Turks and Caicos. And all of this was to try to see if we could get these Americans released with just paying a fine and not having any jail time.
So let's break down those conversations, if you would, for us. How are the conversations with the detainees? Because one of them is your constituent.
Yes, I have a constituent, Brian Hagrick, and he's actually going to be sentenced tomorrow. He had 20 rounds, 20 rounds of ammunition mistakenly left in a checked bag. And when he was departing the island, that's when Turks and Caicos discovered it. Now, normally when this happens, it's handled as a Border and Customs Act violation that the tourist pays a fine and is released to their country of origin. Here, though, Brian was taken into custody. The State Department waited 2 whole months before they contacted him even. And now he's facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 12 years in a prison that the UN has flagged for humanitarian rights violations. So this is totally unacceptable. There's 3 other Americans that are currently detained, and they had even smaller amounts of ammunition, all left accidentally in either duffel bags or a purse. For example, with a grandmother from Florida who had two rounds of 9mm ammunition that she was discovered with. So this is completely unacceptable, and it's out of step with how other countries treat individuals that accidentally bring ammunition into a country.
You're calling on the State Department to issue a do not travel to Turks and Caicos. You also met, as you said, with business leaders of the island. I'm sure they wouldn't want this. Talk about those conversations.
So you would think the business leaders on Turks and Caicos wouldn't want to do not travel, and you'd also think they'd be sympathetic to the Americans that are detained. I was shocked because one of our most hostile meetings was with the business community. There was a lot of victim shaming, a lot of victim blaming of these Americans. They made inflammatory comments against Americans and American tourists. They were truly adversarial toward us. I was shocked because when you look at it, the Turks and Caicos economy is almost totally dependent on American tourism. Tourism is roughly 70% of their economy. Americans are roughly 86% of all the tourists coming into Turks and Caicos. We're so prevalent on the island that the Turks use U.S. dollars as their form of currency. Also, imports. 90% of imports going into Turks and Caicos comes from the United States. So we are in a position that we can have a lot of leverage here. I don't think the business leaders were willing to admit that. But certainly the anti-American sentiment I picked up on was very palpable. And I think that's driving a lot of this.
In those meetings, I mean, that is surprising to hear. Was it more of you sitting there and listening? Did you respond? What did your contributions look like?
I really sat back and I listened because I wanted to get a realistic. I wanted them to talk because I wanted to hear what they had to say. Now, I did engage with the government officials. I engaged heavily with our own State Department members. But as far as the business community, I really wanted to hear their side of the story. And at the end of the day, there's no negotiating with the business community. The business community, it's up to them to go to the Turks and Caicos officials, tell them they want these Americans released, and explain to them that their businesses will go under if it's not for American tourism. And what they need to realize is that it takes one order from the Biden State Department. They could do what's called a do not travel order, which would prevent any cruise ship, for example, from leaving a U.S. port and going to Turks and Caicos. That would destroy the economy of Turks and Caicos almost overnight. Additionally, if you're flying into Turks and Caicos going on vacation there, you can't get traveler's insurance, you can't get vacation insurance. So Americans will just choose to go elsewhere. U.S. Virgin Islands, for example, Puerto Rico, but they won't go to Turks and Caicos if we have this do not travel in place.
And when you met with the governor of Turks and Caicos, was there any indication that, he was sympathetic to what you were saying, to the Americans detained there? Any indication he was releasing them?
No, quite the opposite. They kept saying how great their legal system was. There were even comments that it's superior to that of the United States. They were just dug in on these positions. And Brittany, what's really driving this is the fact that you have three families that control power on Turks and Caicos. And this is a small island. We're talking 60,000 people. The landmass is roughly 2.5 size of the District of Columbia. I mean, this is a minuscule nation. Semi-sovereign nation. And what they're really doing is there's internal political pressure of these ruling families to crack down on tourism, specifically American tourists, and they're scapegoating us for the rampant gang problems they're having, which is a direct result of the chaos that you're seeing in Haiti. So it's misdirected. That's why every 3 weeks you have an American getting wrongfully detained in Turks and Caicos under this absurd bill where somebody that has 2 rounds of ammunition is treated as if they're a weapons trafficker or they're somehow fueling gang violence. It's an absurdity, but it's a political calculation of the Turks and Caicos government and the clique that just happens to be in power right now.
I want to bring us to a moment that happened Wednesday. There was a fiery moment involving you at a House Appropriations Committee hearing. You confronted Secretary of State Antony Blinken about this incident. Can you take us to that moment?
Absolutely. So what's so frustrating with Antony Blinken and the Biden administration is all they need to do is issue that do not travel order. They can unilaterally do that. They don't need congressional approval. The other thing that infuriates me is I feel like the State Department officials we met with did not have a good understanding of these cases. It was very clear that they weren't doing health and comfort visits, which is required on them to do when you have a detained American overseas. They also were very unwilling to pressure the Turks and Caicos government. They were unwilling to pressure the business community on the island. Simply said, the State Department under Tony Blinken and Biden, they're weak, they're feckless, and at best, they're incompetent. And I expressed that opinion to the secretary, and I just wanted him to commit that he would that day, yesterday, do a do not travel order on Turks and Caicos. Of course, he's not going to do that because this administration leads from behind. They acquiesce to these banana republics. And the result of it is that you have 4 Americans that are facing 12-year mandatory minimum sentences in prisons that have been flagged by the UN for being prisons of humanitarian concern. So it's very frustrating when I hear the administration and their unwillingness to act on behalf of these Americans.
So you're saying there's no indication they will have a do not travel order on Turks and Caicos?
So far, with the individuals we spoke to in the State Department, they're unwilling to have a do not travel. Now, right now, they have a caution. So the cautionary levels go from 1 to 4. Currently, Turks and Caicos is at a 2, which just says that use caution. But if we elevate this to a level 4, that's the highest you can go, and that's a do not travel. Again, it would overnight cripple the economy at Turks and Caicos. The Biden administration, though, just refuses to use their power and their leverage to bring these Americans home. It's totally frustrating. But Brittany, there's a way we can circumvent the Biden administration. There's actually 2 ways we can do it. Number one, we can go to individual states because states can issue their own do not travel. So I'm going to be on the phone with Florida officials, for example, Texas officials, Virginia officials. Those 3 states are where I'm focusing on because the vast majority of cruise ships leave from those 3 states. So if we get those 3 states to do a do not travel, it's game over for Turks and Caicos. The other thing we can do, and I've had conversations with the chairman of Ways and Means, we can slap a 25% tax on all imports going into Turks and Caicos. That would also bring Turks and Caicos to their knees within a matter of weeks because they just couldn't afford to pay a 25% tax on 90% of the imports coming into their country.
I know you want to work with these other states, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken did say that he welcomes working with you on this, and he also said, bring the information to me after your remarks. Has he reached out to you? Have you been working together? Have you had a one-on-one? Has there been anything other than that moment on Wednesday?
No, it's been totally laughable. We've been trying to work with the Biden administration, the State Department before we went on our congressional delegation, after we got back. And this isn't the only wrongfully detained American that I've dealt with Tony Blinken with. We have a wrongfully detained Pittsburgh man that's in Russia. We've been trying to advocate for his release from a Russian gulag in Siberia for well over a year now, and they've been absolutely unwilling to assist. It seems very clear to me that if you're a celebrity basketball player, you get all the attention in the world. But if you're just some guy from what they perceive as flyover country, you get zero attention from this administration. And it's very clear that they're unwilling to act, not just for the Turks and Caicos, the Americans that are wrongfully detained in Turks and Caicos, but also Americans that are wrongfully detained in Russia as well.
He did say, he did take issue with your comments, obviously. He said the Biden administration has had more success in bringing home arbitrarily detained Americans than in any other previous administration. And that, quote, we brought Americans home from all over the world, and it's our number one priority. As you mentioned, they did bring home Brittany Griner, 5 Americans from Iran, 10 Americans from Venezuela, just to name a few places. So you're saying, but in this situation, they're not doing enough.
Well, let's talk about those other situations, because they did bring Brittany Griner home, and I'm very happy for that. But it cost us the merchant of death, one of the most dangerous men in the world who should never have been released. And if he was released, he should have been released for Mark Fogel. He's the teacher from Pittsburgh that's wrongfully detained. He should have been released for Whelan, the U.S. Marine that's wrongfully detained in Russia. I don't think Gerskovich was detained at that period of time, but we should have got all our wrongfully detained Americans home from Russia for the merchant of death. If you want to talk about Iran, they got the prisoners back from Iran because they released $6 billion of assets that the Iranians had frozen in, I believe, South Korea. And what happened right after that? The Iranians used that money to fund the Houthi rebels, to fund Hamas, to fund Hezbollah, and you had the attacks on October 7th. It was a complete disaster. And then as far as Venezuela, because the Biden administration has declared war on American energy, specifically natural gas, they go to Venezuela, they cut this deal, they ease sanctions on Venezuela so the Venezuelan economy can improve, and Biden can flood the U.S. with Venezuelan energy instead of using the energy that we have here in the United States. So even in the situations where they've had prisoners exchanged, it's been a colossal failure, an absolute joke, and it's weakened America, not only vis-a-vis our allies like Israel, for example, who's not really happy about the $6 billion being released from Iran, but it's also made us a laughingstock that we're refusing to use our own energy and going to dictators in Venezuela, begging for them to produce more oil and lifting the sanctions on them. So he can hide behind those disasters. Again, I'm happy all those Americans are home, but the price they have paid is absolutely absurd. If we just showed some strength and vitality in our foreign affairs, in our position in the world, we would be able to secure the release of all these Americans that are wrongfully detained.
I want to talk about just a few of them who are are detained in Turks and Caicos. Your constituent, you noted he's a dad. He has no past criminal record. There was also a grandma who said, hey, I accidentally was carrying this ammunition. Now these people are facing 12 years. Going forward, what are you going to do as a member of Congress to ensure these types of situations don't happen again?
Well, what we need is that do not travel. And when you ask the State Department to do that, they say we only reserve do not travels for countries like Russia and Iran and North Korea. The difference here, Brittany, is that when an American travels to North Korea, they know what's at stake. They know to write a will and leave behind a DNA sample because chances are they're going to be detained. When an American goes to Turks and Caicos, they think they're going to some beaches resorts or some sandals resort at a friendly nation where there's no chance of being wrongfully detained. That's why it's so important that we elevate this to a level 5, because Americans don't suspect this and the State Department is not warning them of it. And again, all the Americans that have been detained, I believe there's 6 in total. One has already served 8 months, by the way, in that prison. They've all pled guilty to having the ammunition. The difference is that they did not intend to bring the ammunition in. They were all left in a bag accidentally. Meaning, legally speaking, there's no mens rea, meaning there's no evil mind, there's no intent to break the law. And for that reason, that should be taken into account, and they should pay a fine and get released, not have 12-year sentences hanging over their head. And if I could just say this about my constituent, he's burned through over $100,000 of his savings, his children's college education fund. I mean, even though these Americans are detained and they're on house arrest now, thankfully they're all on house arrest, but they're still burning through their savings. Turks and Caicos is incredibly expensive. I got a cup of coffee one morning, just a black cup of coffee. It was $9. One of the detainees told me that a bag of Oreos is $15 to $17. You have one that I believe is from Oklahoma telling me that he's living on rice and hot dogs because it's all he can afford. He went to Turks and Caicos on a bachelor party, and he's been detained there now for weeks. So the financial position that our Americans are in is very dire. Not to mention that if they get sent to this prison, there's huge concerns for their safety in a Turks and Caicos jail.
Congressman, I really appreciate the conversation today. You're welcome back anytime. And as the situation develops, I hope you join me again.
Thank you, Brittany. I really appreciate it. And can I just say one final thing? The Turks and Caicos government says that they're just applying this law to everybody and Americans aren't treated any differently. That's a blatant lie. They had a Brazilian that was caught in a very similar circumstance with a few rounds of ammunition. That Brazilian was allowed to leave that day after paying a fine and return to Brazil. When we had a grandmother from Florida that had 2 rounds of 9mm in her purse, that grandmother was chained to a desk for 3 days, totally dependent on the other Americans to bring her food, water, blankets, a pillow. So it's very clear that the Turks and Caicos government is targeting American citizens and that we're paying the price. And again, this is all because of the Biden administration's weakness and failure to act.
Really quick, just one question. When they're confronted with this, saying, hey, there's a disparity here in the way you're treating Americans versus people from other countries, what's their response?
Oh, they just they blow it off, or they change the subject. We brought it up at meeting after meeting. And by the way, our own State Department did that. I asked the State Department officials if they knew of any other cases where non-U.S. citizens were detained, and they told me no. I then brought up the Brazilian case, and then they knew about the case. So they were obviously lying to the Congressional delegation and withholding information. It was very clear that the State Department officials were either didn't know their facts, and the Congressional delegation knew the facts better than the State Department did, or that they were withholding information from the Congressional delegation to present Turks and Caicos in the best light possible. They're either misleading and lying to us, or they just don't know the facts. Both of those are absolutely horrifying, and this is happening under Biden and Blinken.
Congressman, thank you again.